There's a particular kind of courage that looks from the outside exactly like destruction. Not the courage of the public gesture, not the protest sign held aloft or the declaration made into a microphone before a watching world. That kind of courage has an audience and is shaped, however unconsciously, by its presence. The other kind, the kind that happens in empty rooms in the small hours without witnesses, that is the rarer thing. The kind that costs more because nobody will ever know what it cost. The kind that requires you to put your hands on the thing you have built, the thing that represents your best effort and your truest expression and the accumulated work of years, and break it. John Lennon broke a record in 1966, not metaphorically, not creatively. He picked up a vinyl acetate, a demo disc, a physical object containing the recorded sound of his own voice singing something he had made, and he smashed it in an empty room, without telling anyone, without explanation, without the kind of dramatic gesture that creates a story for later repetition. Just a man and a record and a decision made in the silence of the early morning that nobody was there to witness or document or interpret. The record is gone. What was on it has never been confirmed. The decision to destroy it has been described in fragments by the handful of people who knew it had happened, never fully, never with the specificity that would satisfy the question the story immediately produces. What was on it? That question has no definitive answer, and that is precisely why it matters, because what the question points toward is something larger than any specific piece of music could contain. Points toward the year 1966 itself, toward what John Lennon was going through in that year, what he was becoming, what he was discarding, and what the act of destruction made possible that the act of preservation never could have. It points toward the specific, often overlooked truth that the work an artist destroys shapes the work they go on to make, that the negative space of what is removed is as constitutive as what remains. This is the story of a record that no longer exists, and of everything that was born from the silence it left behind. To understand 1966, you have to understand what 1963, 1964, and 1965 had done to John Lennon. They had made him the most famous person on Earth, or very nearly. The Beatles had arrived in America in February 1964, and the world had reorganized itself around their presence with the speed and completeness of a chemical reaction that cannot be reversed. By 1965, they were not simply famous. They were something the culture had not had before and did not have adequate language for, genuinely, completely, inescapably global in a way that felt new, that felt like a different order of magnitude from the fame that had existed before them. John was at the center of it. He was the wit, the sharpness, the irreverence that made the band seem dangerous as well as charming. He gave the interviews that people quoted for years afterward. He wrote the lyrics that pushed the edges of what pop music was allowed to say. He was 22, 23, 24 years old, and the world had decided he was important, and the weight of that decision pressed on him in ways that the world could not see because the performance of handling it was part of what the world was watching. Performance was convincing. It was also exhausting in a way that accumulated slowly, invisibly, until the weight of it was everywhere inside him and nowhere visible on the outside. The touring was the most specific form the exhaustion took. The Beatles had been touring almost continuously since 1963, hundreds of dates, city after city, country after country, the same songs performed to stadiums of 60,000 people who could not hear the music over their own screaming. This was not a hyperbolic complaint. It was a literal acoustic reality. The band could not hear what they were playing. The monitors were inadequate, the amplification insufficient against the volume of 60,000 simultaneous human voices in a state of something close to ecstatic crisis. They were performing music they could not hear, for audiences who could not hear it either, in service of an experience that had very little to do with music and everything to do with the phenomenon of their own fame. John had begun to find this not merely exhausting but philosophically intolerable. He was a person who cared specifically and deeply about the music, about what the notes said, what the lyrics carried, what the sound did to the person receiving it. The idea of performing that music in conditions where its content was irrelevant, where the audience's experience was entirely disconnected from anything he was actually doing, had begun to feel like a form of dishonesty so fundamental that he could not continue it without losing something essential. He was also changing. The music he was making privately, the ideas he was developing, the sounds he was beginning to hear in his own head, had moved very far from the 3-minute pop song that stadiums were built to receive. He had been reading, he had encountered people, Yoko Ono, whose influence was beginning to enter his thinking even before their relationship became what it would become. The writers and artists and philosophers whose work the fame had made it possible for him to encounter and whose ideas were reorganizing the way he heard everything. He was becoming someone whose artistic vision had outgrown the container that the Beatles' public identity provided, and he was recording. In the studio, in the hours that were not consumed by touring and interviews and the management of the public identity, John was making things. Not all of them found their way onto records. Not all of them were shared with the other Beatles or with producers or with anyone. Some of them were private experiments, explorations, the kind of work that an artist does when they are trying to find where the edge of their current capability is and what lies beyond it. Some of this work was recorded onto acetate discs, demos, the industry term for preliminary recordings made to capture an idea before the formal session in which it would be developed and refined. But some of what John was recording in 1966 went beyond what that word suggests. Some of it was further than demo, further from the commercial, further from the singable, further from anything that the audience who had given him his fame would have recognized as belonging to the artist they had claimed. And one night in 1966, he listened back to one of these recordings. He listened to it in an empty room, without the mediation of other people's responses, without the buffer of professional context, without anything between him and the sound of his own voice. Doing something he had made, he listened to it, and then he smashed it. The room where it happened has never been definitively identified. The accounts that exist, fragmentary, second-hand, arriving through the kind of oblique reference that people make when they are describing something they witnessed at the edge rather than the center, suggest Abbey Road Studios. Suggest late in the year, after the summer touring had ended with the final concert at Candlestick Park in San Francisco on August 29, 1966. Suggest the early hours of the morning, when the official sessions had wrapped and most people had gone home, and the building had achieved the particular quality of emptiness that large institutions achieve in the small hours, not truly empty, but emptied of purpose, of direction, of the social structure that normally organizes behavior within them. John was alone or nearly alone. Someone was there or someone arrived and found the aftermath because the story survived, even in its fragmentary form, and stories do not survive complete solitude. What is consistent across the versions is this: he had been listening to something he had recorded. He had listened to it more than once. And then he had destroyed the physical object that contained the recording, and he had not expressed regret about it, and he had not explained it, and the people who knew about it had, for their own reasons or at his implicit request, not made it into a story that circulated publicly. What was on the record, the speculation across the years has produced several theories. That it was an early version of a song that was later recorded in a very different form, Strawberry Fields forever being the most frequently cited candidate, with the logic that the early version had been too direct, too unmediated, too nakedly confessional in ways that the final recording's strange, layered quality deliberately encoded and protected. That it was something entirely different, an experiment so far outside what the Beatles were known to do that releasing it would have been professionally catastrophic in ways that even the most adventurous of their contemporaries could not have supported. That it was not music at all in the conventional sense, but something closer to what Yoko's work had been gesturing toward, sound as conceptual art rather than song, organized noise rather than organized melody. That it was simply something he had heard back and found false, not technically deficient, not commercially unsuitable, just false, not true enough to the thing it was trying to be, not alive enough to justify the existence of the object that contained it. This last possibility is the most interesting and the most human. John Lennon had a specific and demanding relationship with truth in his art. It was not a relationship he had arrived at theoretically, through the study of aesthetics or the influence of a particular artistic tradition. It had grown from something more fundamental, from the experience of making music that reached people in the way his best music reached people, of feeling the specific quality of connection that happens when something true is transmitted and received, and of learning, through repetition, to recognize the absence of that quality when it was absent. He could hear when something was false, not wrong in the technical sense, not out of tune, not rhythmically imprecise. False in the deeper sense, not alive. Not genuinely felt, constructed rather than discovered, performing emotion rather than transmitting it. He had a reliable internal instrument for this distinction, and by 1966 that instrument had become extremely sensitive, had been calibrated by years of making things and hearing them back and learning what the difference felt like from the inside, to a degree that made it very difficult to pass off the constructed thing as the discovered one. This calibration had a history. It had been built note by note across the years since the boy in Liverpool had first discovered that music could carry the things inside him that had no other form, that a chord sequence, a melody, the specific texture of a voice saying specific words at a specific pace, could transmit something that language alone could not reach. He had learned this from the music he loved before he made music of his own, from the Elvis records Julia had played on Sunday afternoons, from the Chuck Berry songs that felt like messages from a different world, from the Buddy Holly recordings that proved that sincerity and technique were not opposites but partners. He had learned, listening to those records, what the difference between a song that was alive and a song that was merely competent felt like in the body, the specific quality of something that had come from somewhere real, that was transmitting genuine feeling rather than a reasonable facsimile of it. And he had carried that standard, that embodied understanding of the difference, into everything he made. It was the standard that had produced the best of his early work, the songs that reached people in ways that were not fully explicable by the craft involved, that landed in listeners with a force disproportionate to the apparent simplicity of the material. It was the standard that by 1966 had become demanding enough to constitute a kind of burden, the inability to accept the imperfect thing, even when the imperfect thing was the best available option, even when the alternative was nothing. The record may have failed that test. The recording may have been in the privacy of an empty room at the early hours of a 1966 morning, with no audience and no professional context to mediate the judgment, simply not true enough. And if that was the case, then the act of smashing it was not destruction. It was discernment. It was the exercise of an artistic conscience that had become strict enough to refuse the imperfect thing, even when the imperfect thing was the work of considerable effort, even when destroying it left nothing in its place. There is a cost to this kind of strictness. The cost is that the thing you have destroyed cannot be retrieved, and you do not know at the moment of destruction whether what you will make to replace it will be better, or whether you will make anything at all, or whether the act of refusal is the beginning of something or simply the end of it. John smashed the record and did not know what would come next. What came next was 1967. Strawberry Fields Forever was recorded in November and December of 1966, released in February 1967. It is, by most critical accounts, one of the most important and original pieces of music that the Beatles produced, a recording that departed so completely from the conventions of what pop music was supposed to be that it had to be heard several times before the novelty of it began to resolve into the beauty of it. The song was personal in a way that John's earlier writing had been personal only in glimpses. It was hallucinatory and tender and specifically autobiographical, returning to the Liverpool of his childhood, to the Salvation Army garden near Menlove Avenue that had been called Strawberry Field, to the child who had peered through those gates at a world just out of reach. It said, directly and without defense, nothing is real. It said, let me take you down, which was an invitation and a vulnerability simultaneously. Here, come with me. I'm going to show you something that is true for me, and I don't know if you'll find it true for you, but I'm going to show it to you anyway. The production was unlike anything on any previous Beatles record. Double-tracked vocals processed in ways that gave John's voice a quality of distance and intimacy simultaneously, the voice of someone speaking from somewhere inside a memory rather than from the present moment. The orchestral elements appeared and disappeared in ways that served the song's dreamlike logic rather than any conventional arrangement principle. The final version was made by splicing together two takes recorded in different keys and at different speeds, a technical impossibility that producer George Martin and engineer Jeff Emerick solved by adjusting the playback speed until the keys aligned. A solution so unexpected that it could only have been arrived at by people who had stopped caring whether the method was supposed to work. Did the smashed record lead to strawberry fields forever? Did the destruction of whatever had been on that acetate create the space, the urgency, the refusal of the easy thing that produced the hard and extraordinary thing in its place? There is no way to know. The record is gone. The version of the song that might have been on it if it was on it is gone. What exists is the song itself, the one that was kept, the one that was finished and released, and that has been playing ever since. But the negative space of the smashed record is in the song. The strictness that made the destruction possible is in the song. The quality of something that has been arrived at rather than produced, that has passed through an internal judgment more demanding than any external one, that has survived its own creator's willingness to refuse it if it was not true enough, that quality is audible to anyone who listens for it in every note. SGT, Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band followed in June 1967, then Magical Mystery Tour, then the White Album, then Abbey Road. Then the solo work that began after the Beatles dissolved, the rawness of John Lennon/Plastic Ono Band, the idealism of Imagine, the warmth of Double Fantasy. Across all of it, the quality persisted, the quality of someone whose internal instrument for truth had been calibrated to a standard that most artists never reach and then relax, or reach only occasionally and cannot sustain. John sustained it. Not always perfectly. He was human, and there were songs that fell short, and he knew they fell short, and he said so with characteristic directness in the interviews of his later years. But the commitment to the standard was consistent. The willingness to refuse the false thing, even when the false thing was convenient, even when it was easier, even when it was all he had, that willingness did not waver. It had been established or confirmed or made irreversible on a night in 1966 in an empty room when nobody was watching. He smashed a record, he left himself with nothing, and then he made some of the most extraordinary music the 20th century produced, because the space that the smashing had opened was the only space large enough to contain what the music needed to be. That is what destruction can be when it is not performed and not witnessed and not explained, not the end of something, the beginning of everything that the preserved thing could never have allowed. John Lennon did not keep the record. He did not keep the safety of whatever was on it, the fallback position, the thing he could have pointed to and said, "Here, this is what I was doing, judge me on this." He let it go. He broke it in an empty room and walked away and did not look back. What he walked toward was strawberry fields forever, was in my life, was Imagine, was the full body of work that a generation received as the sound of someone telling the truth about what it felt like to be alive in the 20th century. The smashed record made it possible. The absence is part of the music. The silence where the destroyed thing was is in every song that came after it, audible, if you know to listen for it, as the specific quality of someone who has refused the easy thing so completely, so privately, so without the comfort of an audience to affirm the refusal, that what remains is the only thing left. The true thing, the hard thing, the thing that has been playing ever since. What do we lose when a great artist destroys their own work? And what becomes possible in the space that the destruction leaves behind? The record is gone. The silence it left is in everything that followed. Listen for it. It's there.